Thank you for joining me today on this Islands of Sanity podcast. Back in November, I did a podcast on becoming the author of one's own life. And today, I want to continue that conversation and begin a new conversation on the topic of reclaiming inner authority in an authoritarian age. An American poet from the Midwest, Theodore Roethke, experienced recurring bouts of undiagnosed bipolar disorder throughout his entire adult life. We feel some of his anguish in a poem that he wrote called The Waking, in which he asks the question, what is madness but nobility of soul at odds with circumstance? Within that question, we feel his struggle with mental illness and his pushback against self-blame. It's as if he is adamantly declaring that he's not a bad person, but rather that his soul is noble, yet at odds with the society around him and the circumstances in which he finds himself. But what does he mean by nobility of soul anyway? The storyteller and mythologist Michael Meade defines nobility of soul as one's deepest essence, one's most authentic and genuine humanity. Inherent in his definition is the notion that the soul is not the same as the ego that drives the mind and body. Rather, it's something more original, more innocent, pure, and more trustworthy. Some would describe it as beyond human or divine, whereas I would define it as the ultimate integration of both. What we know with certainty is that when external authority is foisted upon us in ways that harm the soul, we are driven toward madness. And in extreme instances of such oppression, we become psychotic. Contrary to the uber-individualistic worldview of Ayn Rand, who penned The Virtue of Selfishness, author and Jungian therapist Paul Levy notes that Native Americans tended to think of selfishness not as a virtue, but as a virus. In his extraordinary book, Dispelling Wetiko, Levy elaborates on Wetiko, which is a Cree term for the virus of selfishness. According to Levy, Wetiko, that's spelled W-E-T-I-K-O, Wetiko psychosis, says Levy, is at the very root of humanity's inhumanity to itself in all its various forms. And of course, Levy does not exclude the Earth community as a victim of human Wetiko. The origin of Wetiko is the human psyche, or as the modern Swiss psychologist Carl Jung named it, the human shadow, which is comprised of parts of ourselves that we disown or insist are, quote unquote, not me. In his article, Unsettling America, Levy writes, quote, because full-blown Wetikos are soul murderers who continually recreate the ongoing process of killing their own soul, they are reflexively compelled to do this to others. For what the soul does to itself, it can't help but do to others. In a perverse inversion of the golden rule, instead of treating others how they would like to be treated, Wetikos do unto others what was done unto them. The Wetiko is simply a living link in a timeless, vampiric lineage of abuse. Full-blown Wetikos induce and dream up others to experience what it is like to be part of themselves, which they have split off from and denied, and are thus not able to consciously experience. The part of themselves that has been abused and vampirized. In playing this out, Wetikos are transmitting and transferring their own depraved state of inner deadness to others in a perverse form of trying to deal with their own suffering. Paradoxically, Watikos both try to destroy others' light as it reminds them of what they've killed in themselves, while simultaneously trying to appropriate the light for themselves. Unquote. Watikos do not value their own souls because they've sold their souls for money, power, fame, or other material gains that enhance their ego achievements. Perhaps their souls have been sucked out of them through abuse or other forms of suffering. In any case, the human shadow is uncannily susceptible to the Wetiko virus and to inflicting it upon others. Wetikos often act out authoritarian behavior through bullying, manipulation, lying, social and economic repression, and astonishing levels of corruption and self-aggrandizement. When someone else has authority over you, you can't be the author of your own life. Creative energy must be channeled into survival, and hardening one's heart feels necessary in order to protect oneself and one's loved ones. Now, while it's true that our country has foisted power and control on millions of other people throughout our history, our own domestic form of government has not been authoritarian. Authoritarianism is anti-human because it's not in our human nature to be controlled, repressed, or live under hierarchy. However, since the forces of authoritarianism are pervasive at certain times in human history, such as they are in this moment, we have to remain vigilant, both individually and collectively, by committing to the hard work of protecting human rights and the essential freedoms of liberal democracy. Yes, the democratic process is almost always hard work. It's time-consuming, tedious, and slow-moving. On the other hand, government by fiat, executive order, and the issuing of directives from one leader or a handful of oligarchs is less onerous and usually less fraught with delays. It's quite simply faster and easier. In his paper, The Shocking Paper Predicting the End of Democracy, Professor Sean Rosenberg writes, quote, "Democracy is hard work. And as society's elites, experts and public figures who help those around them navigate the heavy responsibilities that come with self-rule, have increasingly been sidelined, citizens have proved ill-equipped cognitively and emotionally to run a well-functioning democracy. As a consequence, the center has collapsed, and millions of frustrated and angst-filled voters have turned in desperation to right-wing populists," unquote. Rosenberg says that our brains are proving fatal to democracy. Humans just aren't built for it. But you know, it's the hard work of democracy that leaves us vulnerable to Wetiko and often prevents us from being vigilant regarding the liberties we're inclined to take for granted. And yet, the more consciously we're aware of our inextricable connection with all living beings, the more compassion we feel, and the more we value our own nobility of soul and that of others. In his article, The Unsettling America, Levy writes that, quote, "Seeing the field and stepping out of the perspective that we are separate from each other converges into being the same experience. Seeing through the illusion of the separate self, rather than seeing through the separate self as a lens through which we view the world, entails recognizing that even full-blown Wetikos, the master predators themselves, are not separate from us. The big Wetikos are fully embodying in personified form a pathological tendency that exists in potential within ourselves. It's as if they are an externalized materialization of this potential within ourselves that we projected outside of ourselves and literally collectively dreamed up into manifestation. Recognizing this generates compassion for this part of ourselves. It is only through compassion that we immunize ourselves from the virus. Unquote. Again, that's Paul Levy in his article, Unsettling America, which is readily available online. Now, our nobility of soul often erodes as we undervalue or ignore our own self-care. But you know, a toxic culture doesn't value physical, emotional, or spiritual health because it's a culture of death. In that milieu, our health, quote unquote, either becomes equated with status, youthfulness, sexual attraction, and control, or it becomes yet another avenue for cultivating and feeding narcissism. However, as we increasingly value life and our deepest humanity, our nobility of soul, that is, we find ourselves taking better care of ourselves through diet, exercise, adequate sleep and rest, and space for reflection, solitude, and spiritual practice. Not only is self-care good for us, it flies in the face of a culture of death. Grassroots activist Shelley Tagilsky says, quote, self-care is an act of resistance, unquote. In her observation of the lifestyles of activists over many years, Adrienne Marie Brown in Pleasure Activism writes, quote, I've seen how denying our full, complex selves, denying our aliveness and our needs as living, sensual beings increases the chance that we will be at odds with ourselves, our loved ones, our coworkers, and our neighbors on this planet, unquote. Activists sometimes live like martyrs who deny themselves proper rest, food, healthy friendships, spiritual enrichment, the enjoyment of art, beauty, and sexual pleasure. In this kind of, you might say, political asceticism, they injure the nobility of their souls. While they may be extremely erudite and well-informed regarding current events, they do not nurture the mind with meditation or non-escapist mindfulness practices. Many suffer from a dearth of emotional intelligence, sometimes ignoring or repressing emotions such as grief or fear. The heart and soul become arid and armored, while the body may suffer from lack of exercise, play, or direct contact with nature. One of the great revolutionaries of all time, Emma Goldman, wrote, quote, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution, unquote. Lack of self-care directly stifles our aliveness. We eventually may become so focused on the cause that we begin to die. Obviously, the extinction of species, including our own, and our own natural trajectory toward death dictate that we are dying every single day. However, we further participate in a culture of death by failing to care for ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. We hasten our death and ignore what so many noble of soul in the face of resistance and death have taught us. Viktor Frankl in Auschwitz displayed extraordinary nobility of soul, as did Thomas More in the Tower of London, Nelson Mandela throughout 27 years in prison, Sophie Scholl as she willingly walked to the guillotine as the sentence for her resistance against the Nazi engulfment of Germany, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. in the Birmingham jail. A West African proverb states, quote, "When death comes, may it find you fully alive," unquote. Some would argue that self-care is narcissistic. What makes you so special or entitled to it, they ask. But I ask, if you wish to liberate the oppressed from their chains, must you bear the weight of your own chains? In the activist protests against self-care, I hear a twisted survivor guilt and an amorphous self-flagellation that serves no one, particularly one's own soul. A recent example of commitment to prioritizing self-care is the former Kansas City, Missouri mayoral candidate, Jason Kander. A brilliant attorney, author, Army veteran, and politician, Kander dropped out of the 2019 mayoral race because he realized that he needed treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. His decision, I think, was beyond courageous and risky. Would he be forever labeled as weak, unstable, or even mentally ill? How many other politicians would publicly announce such a decision? This was a moment in his life best described by the name of his son, True. Perhaps being vibrantly alive is the best revenge. Perhaps it's the most authentic ingredient in our nobility of soul. Authoritarian perspectives thrive in a time of war, in a time of inequality and racial divide, in a time when nobility of soul is devoured or diminished. It also thrives in a culture that places high value on overachievement, busyness, and speed, digital or otherwise. From my perspective, one of the most potent ingredients for maintaining nobility of soul is eros. Defined by popular culture as synonymous with sexual pleasure, eros, E-R-O-S, is actually our sense of embodiment, our enjoyment of connectedness with other humans and nature, our appreciation of beauty and pleasure, and our capacity to deeply reflect and make meaning in our lives. Another aspect of eros that is tragically in short supply in our culture is intimacy. Like the word eros itself, the definition of intimacy has been distorted to mean only sexual intimacy, when in fact, intimacy simply means seeing and being seen. Deep intimacy means the willingness to allow someone to see who we really are, warts and all, and being able to see who the other person is, warts and all, and making space for what we see. Seeing and being seen may happen with a romantic partner or not, but it can really happen with anyone. In a culture where genuine seeing and being seen so rarely happens, the experience of authentic intimacy is a holy, sacred experience. And when we truly experience intimacy, we can feel the sacredness in the moment. In an authoritarian society, intimacy is a rare, even forbidden experience. In fact, everything mitigates against intimacy. People become increasingly atomized, separate, estranged from themselves and from other people. No one knows exactly who to trust, and paranoia is a way of life. In accounts of various resistance movements in authoritarian societies, we often see examples of intimacy between resistors, but the repression that dominates the society makes trust difficult, even among comrades and allies. Our vigilance regarding Wetiko and our commitment to protecting the nobility of soul does put us at odds with circumstance. Yet, these do not automatically condemn us to madness. Rather, these are sovereign declarations that we, not any institution or regime, are authors of our own lives. While self-care and inner autonomy are necessary in an authoritarian culture, they're not enough when facing the ravages of Wetiko and when trying to remain faithful to one's own truth in an authoritarian world. People resisting authoritarianism must develop allies and a strong support system of trusted others, which is challenging, sometimes seemingly impossible, in the face of increased divisions in society, increased paranoia, and heightened distrust. The truth is that if we have no opportunities for experiencing intimacy, we are not fully alive, and we begin to wither and die. Because we're wired for intimacy. And when we're unskilled in intimacy or circumstances mitigate against it, we're not fully alive. And a dearth of intimacy takes its toll on the body and emotions. I'm aware of some venues where conscious intimacy building is supported among people who are awake to climate catastrophe and the collapse of industrial civilization. 3 of those venues that I'm aware of are The Work That Reconnects, founded by Joanna Macy, Positive Deep Adaptation, founded by Jem Bendel, and the Good Grief Network, founded by Laura Schmidt and Amy Lewis Rowe. All 3 organizations have a strong presence on Facebook and on the internet in general. As repression increases and resistance movements increase their numbers and their activism, intimacy training will be necessary, and I mean a necessary part of their efforts. Intimacy deepens and strengthens our humanity, and if we don't strengthen our humanity, we have nothing to fight for. In late April 2020, I will begin a 4-week online series entitled Reclaiming Inner Authority in an Authoritarian World. Sessions will happen for 2 hours on Saturdays and will include not only open conversations, but breakout groups where people can dialogue in smaller groups. People will be encouraged to connect between sessions, and we'll take a hard look at possible scenarios that we must prepare for as authoritarianism intensifies in our world. So please stay connected with my website, carolynbaker.net, and my Facebook page for details. In preparation for the online series, I'll be devoting several podcasts to discussing very simple ways that we can reclaim our inner authority in a world that is becoming more authoritarian every day. Meanwhile, if you found today's conversation helpful, please consider making a small donation after you've heard this podcast, and please invite your friends to listen as well. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for helping me create islands of sanity in a sea of chaos.